This isn't another self-help theory or positive thinking technique. This is ancient wisdom that's been tested by people who faced unimaginable suffering and found a way through that doesn't involve fighting yourself or forcing change. By the time we finish this journey together, you'll understand exactly why trying to push away difficult emotions actually makes them stronger, and you'll know the precise method that dissolves them instead. Welcome to Moonmind Temple, where we discover that freedom isn't about becoming someone different. It's about recognizing the peace that's been waiting inside you all along. Right now, as you're listening to this, something remarkable is happening around the world. Someone in Tokyo is finding comfort in these same words as their day begins. Another person in London is letting their shoulders relax as evening falls. Maybe you're in New York, curled up before sleep, or in Sydney, taking a peaceful walk. If it feels right, share where you're listening from, not because you have to, but because there's something beautiful about knowing we're all seeking the same peace, just in different time zones. You might want to get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in something soft, dim the lights, or simply let your body settle wherever you are. Because what you're about to discover will change how you relate to every difficult moment for the rest of your life. Here's what I know about you, even though we've never met. You've tried to control your reactions and sometimes succeeded, but the patterns keep coming back. You've probably told yourself to just stay positive or let it go, but found that the more you fight certain feelings, the more persistent they become. You might even feel frustrated with yourself for not being able to simply choose peace. But here's the truth that changes everything. Those patterns aren't a sign that you're failing. They're actually doorways to freedom, if you know how to approach them. During the Vietnam War, when brothers were forced to kill brothers with foreign weapons and imported ideologies, a young monk named Thich Nhat Hanh discovered something that saved his sanity and eventually transformed millions of lives. While bombs fell around him and his country tore itself apart, he found that the enemy wasn't outside. It was the habit of fighting against reality itself. He learned this from studying someone called Avalokiteshvara, which means the one who listens to the cries of the world. But this wasn't just an ancient figure from Buddhist stories. It was a capacity that lived inside every human being. The ability to be present with suffering without adding to it, to listen without trying to fix, to offer the kind of attention that actually heals. Think about the last time someone truly listened to you. Not waiting for their turn to speak, not trying to solve your problems, but really hearing you. How did that feel in your body? What happened to your breathing, your tension, your sense of being alone with whatever you were carrying? That same quality of listening, that same presence, is what transforms the difficult emotions inside us. But here's the part that will surprise you. It's not about getting rid of anger or anxiety or sadness. It's about changing your relationship with them so completely that they lose their power to control your life. Tonight, you'll discover why the Buddha said that fighting our emotions is like trying to stop a river with our bare hands. You'll learn the practice that's like becoming the riverbank instead, solid, present, and unshaken by whatever flows through. You'll hear the story of a young boy who broke a pattern of inherited anger that had passed down through generations, and how that single breakthrough healed not just his future, but somehow reached back to heal his ancestors too. Most importantly, you'll experience what Thich Nhat Hanh called arriving at your true home, that place of peace that doesn't depend on your circumstances being perfect or your emotions being pleasant. It's the home that can't be taken away by difficult people, challenging situations, or even your own mental storms. This isn't about becoming a monk or learning complicated meditation techniques. These are simple practices that work while you're stuck in traffic, dealing with difficult family members, or lying awake at 3 a.m. They're as practical as they are profound, as gentle as they are powerful. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to discover why the path to freedom begins not with fighting your patterns, but with learning to listen to them with the same compassion you'd offer a frightened child. Now let me tell you about the most powerful healing force in the world, one that requires no special training, costs nothing, and yet most of us have forgotten how to use it. It's the art of truly listening, not just to the words someone speaks, but to the pain beneath the words, the hope hiding behind the anger, the love that's trying to express itself through frustration. There's a figure in Buddhist tradition whose very name holds the secret to transforming suffering, and when you understand what this name really means, it changes everything about how you approach the difficulties in your own life. Avalokiteshvara, the one who listens to the cries of the world. In Vietnamese, this compassionate presence is called Quan Thiam, and in Chinese Guan Yin. But regardless of the language or culture, the essence remains the same, the recognition that deep, compassionate listening has the power to heal wounds that nothing else can touch. This isn't about having supernatural abilities or being able to solve everyone's problems with the right words. It's about something far more profound and accessible, the understanding that when we offer another person our complete, non-judgmental presence, we create a sacred space where transformation naturally begins to unfold. The Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh discovered this truth during the darkest period of his life, and his understanding grew from witnessing how this simple practice could heal even the deepest wounds of war and separation. But Avalokiteshvara isn't someone outside of us, some distant figure we pray to for help. According to Buddhist teaching, every single person carries this seed of compassionate listening within their own consciousness. It's like having a hidden room in your house that you've never discovered, filled with exactly what you need to help both yourself and others find peace. The question isn't whether you have this capacity, you do. The question is whether you'll learn to water this seed through practice, allowing it to grow strong enough to manifest when it's needed most. Think of your consciousness as a garden where many different seeds are planted in the rich soil of your awareness. There's a seed of anger there, yes, planted perhaps by years of frustration and disappointment. But there's also a seed of patience, strengthened every time you chose to stay calm when provoked. There's a seed of fear, watered by experiences of loss and uncertainty. But equally present is a seed of courage, growing stronger each time you faced something difficult and chose to move forward anyway. There's a seed of judgment, fed by our culture's constant comparison and criticism. But also quietly growing is a seed of acceptance, nourished by every moment you've chosen to love someone exactly as they are. Which seeds flourish and shape your responses to life depends entirely on which ones receive your attention and energy through daily choices. Every time someone speaks to you with irritation and you automatically respond with more irritation, you're watering the seed of anger in both of you. But every time someone shares their pain and you respond with presence and understanding, you're nourishing the seeds of compassion and wisdom. This isn't just beautiful philosophy. It's describing how your brain actually rewires itself based on the patterns you repeatedly choose. Let me share with you a story that perfectly illustrates this truth, one that took place at a peaceful monastery in the French countryside, where people from around the world came to learn the art of mindful living. Every summer, a young boy would visit this sanctuary with his younger sister, both of them eager to discover practices that could bring more peace to their daily lives. But this boy carried a heavy burden that many children know too well. He had a troubled relationship with his father. The pattern was always the same and heartbreakingly familiar. Whenever the boy would fall down and hurt himself, instead of receiving comfort or gentle care, his father would immediately shout at him. "How could you be so careless?" his father would demand. "Why weren't you paying attention?" The boy would stand there, bleeding and in pain, feeling not only the physical hurt, but also the deeper wound of not being comforted in his moment of need. Year after year, this young boy made himself a solemn promise. When he grew up and had children of his own, he would never, ever be like his father. If his child fell down and got hurt, he wouldn't shout or blame. He would rush to help, offer comfort, and make everything better. This determination lived in his heart, like a flame, fueling his commitment to break the cycle of harsh responses that had caused him so much pain. One particular summer day at the monastery, the boy was playing peacefully when his sister and another little girl decided to play on a hammock together. Children being children, they were laughing and swinging, lost in the simple joy of the moment. But then something went wrong. The other girl fell from the hammock and hit the ground hard, blood immediately beginning to flow from her injury. What happened next changed this young boy's understanding of himself forever. As he saw the injured girl lying there bleeding, instead of rushing to help with compassion and gentleness, he felt a sudden surge of anger rising in his chest. The words that wanted to burst from his mouth were shockingly familiar. "Stupid. How could you do something like that?" In that moment of crisis, all his good intentions and promises to himself evaporated, and he discovered something that shook him to his core. He was exactly like his father. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable. Because this boy had been practicing mindfulness at Plum Village, he was able to catch himself before the harsh words actually left his mouth. He had developed enough awareness to recognize what was happening inside him. The same pattern of blame and irritation that had hurt him so deeply was now rising in him, ready to hurt someone else. Instead of speaking, he stepped back and watched as other people came to help the injured girl, his heart pounding with the recognition of what he had almost done. As he practiced slow, mindful walking to calm himself down, breathing deeply the way he had learned in the monastery, a profound understanding began to dawn. He wasn't fundamentally different from his father at all. The same energy of anger and impatience that had been transmitted to him was now living inside him, ready to be passed on to the next generation if he didn't learn to transform it. He began to see that his father hadn't been a monster or a bad person. His father had also been carrying inherited patterns of reactivity, probably passed down from his own father and his father's father before that. This insight completely changed how the boy felt about his family history. Instead of seeing himself as a victim of his father's harsh treatment, he began to understand that both he and his father were victims of what Buddhism calls habit energy, deeply ingrained patterns of reaction that get transmitted from generation to generation unless someone learns to transform them. His anger toward his father began to dissolve, replaced by a desire to break the cycle not through blame or resentment, but through understanding and practice. The boy realized that if he didn't learn to work with his own inherited patterns, he would inevitably pass them on to his future children, perpetuating the same cycle of hurt that had caused him so much pain. But he also saw something hopeful, that by learning to respond differently, by practicing mindfulness and compassion, he could heal not only his own future, but somehow reach back to heal the ancestors who had carried these same struggling patterns. When that intention to practice and transform was born in his heart, something beautiful happened. His resentment toward his father just melted away. It was replaced by a deep desire to go home and tell his father, "I have the same kind of energy in me that you do, and I want us to practice together so we can both be free." This young person, through one moment of clear seeing, had discovered the path to healing that extends in both directions, toward the future and toward the past. This story reveals something profound about how transformation actually works. The boy's breakthrough didn't come from fighting against his inherited patterns or trying to suppress his anger. It came from the practice of mindful awareness, the ability to see clearly what was arising within him without being completely swept away by it. This is the foundation of all Buddhist practice, learning to observe our mental and emotional patterns with the same compassionate attention that Avalokiteshvara offers to the cries of the world. But how do we develop this capacity for clear seeing in our own lives? How do we learn to listen deeply, not only to others, but to the voices within ourselves, the worried thoughts, the angry reactions, the inherited patterns that seem to arise automatically whenever we're triggered? The answer lies in understanding what Thich Nhat Hanh discovered during his own journey through suffering and exile. When the Vietnam War tore his country apart, forcing brothers to kill brothers with foreign weapons and imported ideologies, Thich Nhat Hanh and his community started a movement they called "Don't Shoot Your Brother." They tried to voice the concerns of ordinary people who didn't want the war, who saw through the artificial divisions that were being imposed by outside powers. But their calls for peace were silenced by both sides of the conflict. Sometimes, the only way they could get the world's attention was through the ultimate sacrifice. Monks and nuns would burn themselves alive, not out of despair, but as acts of pure love, desperate attempts to wake people up to the madness of the violence. In 1000, 966, when Cornell University invited him to give a series of lectures about the true situation in Vietnam. Thich Nhat Hanh intended to stay in America for only 3 months before returning home to continue his work. But those 3 months stretched into 38 years of exile. The government of South Vietnam revoked his citizenship and banned him from returning, viewing his message of peace as a threat to their war effort. For nearly 4 decades, he couldn't go home to the land he loved, the temples where he had trained, the people he wanted to serve. During the first years of exile, despite being an experienced Dharma teacher with many students, despite having deep intellectual understanding of Buddhist philosophy, Thich Nhat Hanh found himself struggling with a profound sense of homelessness. He would travel from city to city giving lectures, sleeping 1 or 2 nights in each place, waking up in the middle of the night, not knowing where he was. He would have to breathe deeply and orient himself. What city, what country, what continent? The constant displacement was disorienting and exhausting. Night after night, he would dream of returning to his root temple in central Vietnam, climbing the familiar green hill with its beautiful trees. In the dream, he would make it halfway up the hill before waking to the harsh reality that he was still in exile, still separated from everything that felt like home. The same dream repeated again and again, his heart breaking a little more each time. But then something shifted through his practice of mindfulness and deep listening to his own experience. He began to understand that home isn't a place you go to, it's a way of being you can cultivate anywhere. Through breathing mindfully, walking with awareness, and bringing his complete attention to the present moment, he discovered what he called his true home, a state of peace and presence that couldn't be taken away by external circumstances. He developed a simple practice that became the foundation of his teaching. Breathing in, he would say to himself, "I have arrived." Breathing out, he would say, "I am home." Not, "I will arrive someday when conditions are perfect," or "I will be home when I can return to Vietnam," but "I have arrived right here, right now, in this moment." I am home in my own skin, in my own breath, in my own awareness. This wasn't denial of his situation or pretending that exile didn't hurt. It was the recognition that beneath all the changing circumstances of life, the good and the bad, the pleasant and the difficult, there's a place of peace that can't be disturbed. It's what the Buddha called our true nature, the awareness that observes all experiences but isn't destroyed by any of them. Once Thich Nhat Hanh found this true home within himself, the dreams of climbing the hill in Vietnam stopped coming. He no longer suffered from his inability to return to his homeland, even though he would have loved to teach there and serve his people. He had discovered something that could never be taken away, the capacity to be fully present and at peace wherever life took him. This discovery changed everything about how he understood freedom and suffering. He realized that most of our pain comes not from our circumstances themselves, but from our relationship to those circumstances, our resistance to what is, our attachment to how things should be different. When we learn to listen deeply to our experience without immediately trying to change it, we discover that even difficult emotions and challenging situations have something to teach us. But how does this relate to the art of compassionate listening that can transform our daily relationships and inner struggles. When Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of Avalokiteshvara, he was describing the same quality of presence that allowed him to find peace in exile. It's the ability to be with whatever arises, in ourselves or others, without needing to fix, change, or escape from it. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations. It means developing the stability and clarity to respond wisely rather than simply reacting from our conditioning. When someone shares their pain with you, the practice of deep listening means offering them the same spacious presence that you would want in your most difficult moments. You breathe gently and listen not just to their words, but to the human heart underneath the words. You don't try to solve their problems or change their perspective. You simply create a safe space for their truth to be expressed and heard. In that space of acceptance and compassion, healing naturally begins to happen. The same practice applies to your relationship with your own inner experience. When anxiety arises, instead of immediately trying to think your way out of it or distract yourself from it, you can pause and say, "Anxiety is here. What are you trying to tell me?" Often, you'll discover that underneath the surface worry is actually care. You're anxious about something because it matters to you. When you listen to your emotions with this kind of gentle curiosity, they often transform into something more workable. This is the practice that the young boy at the monastery learned, the practice that allowed him to see his anger clearly without being controlled by it. It's the practice that allowed Thich Nhat Hanh to transform the pain of exile into a deeper understanding of true freedom. And it's the practice that can allow you to break free from the automatic patterns that have been running your life, creating space for new possibilities to emerge. Understanding this practice of deep listening requires recognizing something that modern life often obscures. We live in a world where most people have forgotten how to be truly present with each other. We've become skilled at multitasking, at thinking about the next thing while we're supposedly engaged with the current thing, at listening to respond rather than listening to understand. But according to Buddhist wisdom, this scattered attention is one of the root causes of our suffering and disconnection. When Thich Nhat Hanh speaks of the collective energy of mindfulness, he's describing something that can be experienced even in small moments of genuine presence. Imagine sitting with a friend who is going through a difficult divorce, and instead of offering advice or sharing your own relationship experiences, you simply breathe quietly and give them your complete attention. Something shifts in the space between you, a quality of safety and acceptance that allows deeper truths to emerge. Your friend might start by complaining about their ex-partner's faults, but as they feel truly heard, they might begin to share their own fears about being alone, their grief over the dreams that won't come true, their worry about how the children are handling the changes. This is Avalokiteshvara in action, not as a distant spiritual figure, but as the natural flowering of human compassion when we stop trying to fix or change and simply offer our presence. The healing doesn't come from what you say or what advice you give. It comes from the recognition your friend experiences of being truly seen and accepted in their struggle. This kind of witnessing has the power to transform shame into self-compassion, isolation into connection, despair into hope. But developing this capacity requires understanding what Buddhism teaches about the nature of consciousness itself. According to this ancient wisdom, our consciousness has different layers, like a vast lake with depths that most of us never explore. On the surface, we have what's called mind consciousness, our immediate thoughts, reactions, and everyday mental activity. This is the level where we experience our moment-to-moment responses to life, our planning and worrying and remembering. But beneath this surface layer lies what's known as store consciousness, the deeper realm where all our experiences, memories, and inherited patterns are held. The young boy at Plum Village had been carrying his father's pattern of angry response in this store consciousness, probably since he was very small. Every time his father had shouted at him for getting hurt, that experience was stored not just as a memory, but as an imprint that shaped how he himself would respond to situations involving injury or mistake. This is what Buddhism calls habit energy, the accumulated patterns that arise automatically when certain conditions are present. These patterns operate below the level of conscious choice, which is why we can have the best intentions to respond differently, but find ourselves repeating the same reactions that hurt us when we were children. What made the boy's transformation possible was the development of what Buddhism calls mindfulness, the ability to observe what's arising in consciousness without being completely identified with it. When he saw the injured girl and felt the familiar surge of anger and blame, mindfulness allowed him to recognize, this is my father's pattern arising in me, rather than simply acting from that pattern automatically. This moment of recognition created a space between the triggering event and his response, a space where choice becomes possible. This is perhaps the most important understanding in all of Buddhist psychology, that we are not our patterns. We are the awareness that can observe our patterns. The angry reaction that wanted to blame the injured girl wasn't the boy's true nature. It was inherited conditioning, arising in the space of his awareness. When he could see it clearly, he could choose not to act from it. And in that choice, the pattern began to lose its power over him. Thich Nhat Hanh's own journey through exile illustrates this same principle on a much larger scale. When he first found himself unable to return to Vietnam, his initial response was shaped by very human patterns of attachment and longing. He had natural desires to be in familiar places, to serve his people directly, to continue the work he had started in his homeland. The dreams of climbing the green hill to his root temple were expressions of this deep attachment to place and identity. But through his practice of mindfulness, he began to see that his suffering wasn't actually caused by being separated from Vietnam. It was caused by his attachment to the idea that he needed to be in Vietnam to be truly at home. This insight didn't minimize the real pain of separation or suggest that missing his homeland was wrong. Rather, it revealed a deeper truth, that the peace and belonging he was seeking in external circumstances was actually available in every moment through the quality of his presence and awareness. The practice of saying, "I have arrived, I am home," wasn't a mental trick or positive affirmation. It was a recognition of what was already true, that his essential nature, his capacity for peace and wisdom and love, was fully present wherever he happened to be. Home wasn't a place on a map, it was the state of being completely present and awake in the current moment. This realization transformed his exile from a source of ongoing suffering into an opportunity for deeper freedom. This same understanding can transform how we relate to the difficult patterns in our own lives. When anxiety arises, instead of seeing it as an enemy to be defeated or a problem to be solved, we can recognize it as a visitor in the space of our awareness. We can say, "Hello, anxiety, I see you're here. What are you trying to protect?" Often, we'll discover that underneath the surface, worry is actually love. We're anxious about our children because we care about their well-being. Worried about our work because we want to contribute something meaningful. Concerned about our health because we value our life. When we listen to our emotions with this kind of gentle curiosity, they often reveal their deeper wisdom. Anger might be showing us where our boundaries have been crossed. Sadness might be pointing to what we've lost that was precious to us. Fear might be highlighting what we need to protect or prepare for. Instead of being problems to eliminate, our emotions become sources of information and even guidance. This is the practice that transforms not only our inner landscape, but our relationships with others. When someone speaks to us with irritation or criticism, instead of automatically defending ourselves or counterattacking, we can pause and listen for the pain or fear underneath their words. We might hear that their criticism comes from feeling unappreciated, or their anger stems from feeling powerless in some area of their life. This doesn't mean accepting inappropriate behavior, but it allows us to respond from wisdom rather than simply reacting from our own defensive patterns. The boy at Plum Village discovered that when he could see his father as someone who was also carrying inherited patterns rather than as an enemy who had hurt him, his whole relationship to their history changed. He began to understand that his father's harsh responses probably came from his father's father, and so on back, through generations of people who never learned a gentler way to handle their own pain and fear. This insight allowed compassion to arise where there had been resentment, and a desire for mutual healing where there had been a wish for revenge or escape. This is what Thich Nhat Hanh means when he talks about healing that extends both into the future and back into the past. When we transform our own patterns through mindful awareness and compassionate understanding, we're not only ensuring that these patterns won't be passed on to the next generation, we're somehow also bringing healing to all the ancestors who carried these same struggles without knowing how to transform them. The practice of deep listening, whether applied to ourselves or others, creates what Buddhism calls merit, positive energy that ripples out far beyond what we can see or measure. Every moment of genuine presence, every choice to respond with understanding rather than reactivity, every instance of seeing clearly through our conditioning contributes to the healing of the world. This isn't mystical thinking. It's recognizing that we're all interconnected and that individual transformation inevitably affects the whole. The seed of Avalokiteshvara, the one who listens to the cries of the world, is already planted in the garden of your consciousness. Every time you choose presence over reactivity, understanding over judgment, compassion over criticism, you're watering this seed and helping it grow. Every time you listen deeply to yourself or another person, you're participating in the healing of the world. Every time you recognize a pattern arising and choose to respond differently, you're breaking chains that may have bound your family line for generations. As we continue this journey together, you'll discover how to cultivate this capacity through simple daily practices that anyone can learn, how the sound of a bell can call you back to your true home, how walking can become a revolutionary act of freedom, and how even ordinary activities like drinking tea can become doorways to profound peace. There's a sound that has the power to call you home to yourself, no matter how scattered your thoughts or how heavy your heart. It's not a magical sound, or one that requires special equipment or years of training to understand. It's as simple as a bell ringing, yet when approached with the right understanding, it becomes a doorway to the most profound transformation you can imagine. In Buddhist communities around the world, the sound of a bell isn't just a signal or a way to mark time. It's considered the voice of the Buddha from within, calling each person back to their true home in the present moment. But this isn't about religion or believing in any particular spiritual figure. It's about recognizing that within each of us lives a capacity for awakeness, for peace, for coming fully alive in the here and now. The practice begins with understanding that even something as simple as inviting a bell to sound can become a sacred act when done with complete mindfulness. You don't just pick up an instrument and make noise. That would be like trying to have a meaningful conversation without first taking a moment to center yourself and consider what you want to communicate. Instead, the person who will ring the bell first prepares themselves through a ritual that transforms both the ringer and everyone who will hear the sound. Picture this scene, because it contains wisdom that can change how you approach every transition in your daily life. Before touching the bellmaster sits quietly and practices mindful breathing. They're not just taking random breaths, they're using their breathing to gather their scattered attention, to calm their nervous system, and to become fully present in their body. This preparation isn't optional or ceremonial, it's essential, because the quality of attention they bring to ringing the bell will be transmitted to everyone who hears it. As they breathe, they silently recite words that have been used for generations to prepare the heart and mind for this moment of service. Body, speech, and mind in perfect oneness, acknowledging that this isn't just a physical action, but an integration of their entire being. I send my heart along with the sound of this bell, recognizing that what they're offering isn't just vibration in the air, but their own caring intention for the well-being of others. May the hearers awaken from their forgetfulness and transcend the path of anxiety and sorrow, expressing their deep wish that this simple sound might help others remember their own capacity for peace. When you understand what's happening in this preparation, you realize it's a model for how to approach any action in your life with greater intention and effectiveness. How different would your day be if you took just a moment before important conversations, before meals, before beginning work, to gather your attention and set a positive intention? How much more helpful could you be to others if you approached each interaction not as a task to complete, but as an opportunity to offer your best self? Once the bellmaster is centered and prepared, they don't immediately create the full sound. Instead, they offer what's called a half sound, a gentle warning that alerts everyone in the community that a mindfulness bell is about to ring. This isn't just courtesy, though it is deeply considerate. It's recognizing that the effectiveness of mindfulness practice depends on preparation, on creating the right conditions for awareness to flourish. When people hear this preparatory sound, something beautiful happens throughout the community. Conversations naturally come to a gentle close, not abruptly or with irritation, but with the understanding that they're about to receive a gift. People stop what they're doing and turn their attention inward, preparing to receive the full sound. It's like the difference between being suddenly awakened by an alarm clock and having someone gently touch your shoulder and whisper your name. This creates space for one of the most profound practices in all of Buddhist training, the art of stopping. Not stopping as in giving up or becoming passive, but stopping as in coming to rest in the present moment. In our culture, we're constantly in motion, mentally if not physically. Our minds jump from past to future, from problem to problem, from desire to desire, like restless children who can't sit still. But the sound of the mindfulness bell creates an opportunity to interrupt this endless movement and discover what's available when we simply rest in awareness. After allowing time for everyone to prepare, the bell master invites the bell to sound fully. And now comes the practice that can transform how you relate to every moment of your life. As the sound fills the space, each person practices breathing mindfully and listening deeply. They're not just hearing the vibrations with their ears, they're receiving the sound with their entire being, using it as an anchor for their wandering attention. The traditional practice involves breathing in while silently saying, "Listen, listen," and breathing out while saying, "This wonderful sound brings me back to my true home." But what is this true home that the bell is calling you back to? It's not a place on a map or a building you can drive to. It's the state of being fully present, fully alive, fully aware of the miracle of this moment. Think about the last time you felt completely at home, not necessarily in a particular location, but in a state of being where you felt safe, peaceful, and exactly where you belonged. Maybe it was holding a sleeping child, or walking in nature, or sharing a quiet moment with someone you love. Maybe it was during an activity that absorbed your complete attention, where you lost track of time and self-consciousness. That sense of belonging, of being fully present and content, that's your true home, and it's available in every moment if you know how to access it. The genius of this practice is that it trains your nervous system to associate certain sounds with coming home to peace. After practicing with mindfulness bells, many people find that they can use any sound, a church bell in the distance, the chiming of a clock, even a phone ringing, as a reminder to pause and return to presence. Instead of being constantly pulled away from the moment by external noise, you begin to use sound itself as a pathway back to stillness. There's a particularly beautiful application of this practice that shows how ancient wisdom can transform modern challenges. Instead of rushing to answer the phone on the first ring, you can use the sound as a mindfulness bell. Let it ring while you take 3 conscious breaths, saying to yourself, "Listen, listen. This wonderful sound brings me back to my true home." Then, from this place of centeredness, you walk mindfully to the phone and answer from a state of presence rather than reactivity. This simple shift changes everything about the quality of your phone conversations. Instead of being caught off guard or feeling scattered when the phone rings, you become like a bellmaster yourself, prepared, centered, and ready to offer your best attention to whoever is calling. The person on the other end can feel this quality of presence, even though they may not understand why the conversation feels different. Before making a phone call, you can also prepare yourself with intention, just as the bellmaster prepares before ringing the bell. Take a moment to breathe mindfully and consider what you want to communicate. You might even silently repeat words similar to those used by the bellmaster. Words can travel thousands of miles. May what I say bring about understanding and compassion. May everything I express be as beautiful as flowers and help create more love in the world. This isn't about becoming perfect or never having difficult conversations. It's about approaching communication from a place of awareness rather than autopilot, with the intention to be helpful rather than simply to discharge your own emotions or get your own needs met. When both people in a conversation are practicing this kind of mindful presence, something magical happens. They can actually hear each other, not just the words, but the humanity underneath the words. The practice extends beyond formal meditation periods or phone calls to every transition in your day. In some communities, bells are programmed to ring softly every 15 minutes throughout the day. Each time the bell sounds, people pause whatever they're doing, cooking, working, studying, walking, and take 3 mindful breaths. It's like having a gentle friend who reminds you dozens of times each day to come home to yourself. You can create this same supportive structure in your own life without any special equipment. Set a soft chime on your phone to ring periodically throughout the day. When you hear it, pause and ask yourself, where is my attention right now? Often, you'll discover that your mind has been somewhere else entirely, replaying a conversation from yesterday, worrying about tomorrow's meeting, lost in planning or fantasy. The bell gives you the opportunity to gently guide your attention back to what's actually happening in the present moment. This coming home to the present moment isn't just a nice spiritual practice, it's the foundation for experiencing what one wise teacher called the most wonderful moment of your life. Most people, when asked if the most wonderful moment of their life has arrived yet, would say they're still waiting for it. They imagine it will come when they find the right relationship, achieve a certain goal, reach retirement, or when their problems are finally solved. But this perspective guarantees that the wonderful moment will never arrive, because there will always be another goal, another problem, another reason to postpone happiness. The Buddhist understanding turns this waiting on its head with a radical proposition. You can make the present moment into the most wonderful moment of your life. Not by changing your external circumstances, but by bringing your full awareness to what's already here. When you're completely present, you can touch the miracle that you're alive, that you can see and hear and feel, that your heart is beating, and your lungs are breathing without any effort on your part. This doesn't mean pretending that difficult things aren't happening or forcing yourself to feel grateful when you're in pain. It means recognizing that even in the midst of challenges, there are elements of wonder available if you're present enough to notice them. The warmth of sunlight through a window, the kindness in a stranger's eyes, The simple fact that your body is working to keep you alive. These small miracles are happening constantly, but we miss them when our attention is elsewhere. The practice of returning to the present moment through the sound of a bell is training for this kind of awareness. Each time you pause and breathe mindfully, you're strengthening your capacity to be fully here, fully alive, fully able to receive the gifts that each moment offers. It's like exercising a muscle that most people don't even know they have, the muscle of presence. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this practice is how it redefines the very concept of home. In our mobile, fast-paced world, many people struggle with feelings of rootlessness and displacement. They may have grown up in one place, gone to school in another, and now work in a third, never quite feeling fully settled anywhere. Others may feel homeless, even in familiar surroundings, because of family dysfunction, economic instability, or simply the sense that they don't quite fit in anywhere. The teaching of the mindfulness bell offers a different understanding of home, one that can never be taken away by external circumstances. Your true home isn't a location, but a quality of being, the ability to be present, aware, and at peace with whatever is arising in your experience. This home exists within you, wherever you go, in whatever circumstances you find yourself. It's available whether you're in a palace or a prison, surrounded by loved ones or completely alone. This understanding was tested and proven by a master who spent 38 years unable to return to his homeland. During the first years of this forced separation, he would dream repeatedly of returning to the familiar hills and temples of his youth. He would wake up disoriented, having to remember where he was and why he couldn't go home. The pain of displacement was real and profound. But through the practice of mindful breathing and present moment awareness, something shifted. He began to realize that his suffering wasn't caused by being away from a particular place. It was caused by his attachment to the idea that he needed to be somewhere else, to be truly at home. When he could say with complete sincerity, "I have arrived, I am home," the dreams stopped coming. He had found a home that couldn't be taken away by governments or circumstances or the passage of time. You can practice this same realization in small ways throughout your day. When you're stuck in traffic, instead of feeling frustrated about being delayed, you can breathe mindfully and say, "I have arrived, I am home." When you're waiting in line at the grocery store, instead of feeling impatient, you can use the time to come home to your body and your breath. When you're lying in bed, unable to sleep, instead of fighting with your insomnia, you can rest in awareness itself. The bell sound teaches you that every moment is an arrival, every breath is a homecoming. You don't have to wait for better circumstances or different feelings to be fully here. You can arrive completely in this moment, with whatever it contains, and discover that this arrival is itself the peace you've been seeking. There are many variations of the practice that can deepen your understanding and experience. Some people prefer to use different words with their breathing. Breathing in, I feel calm and relaxed. Breathing out, I smile. Others find meaning in breathing in, I establish myself in the present moment. Breathing out, I know this is a wonderful moment. The specific words matter less than the intention behind them, the commitment to use your breath as a pathway back to presence and peace. What's remarkable is how this simple practice can transform your entire relationship with sound. Instead of experiencing noise as intrusion or distraction, you begin to hear it as invitation to pause, to breathe, to remember who you really are beneath all your thoughts and worries. Church bells become calls to mindfulness. Clock chimes become reminders to come home. Even construction noise or traffic sounds can become opportunities to practice patience and presence. This is the beginning of what some call informal meditation, bringing the quality of awareness that you cultivate in sitting practice into every activity of your life. The sound of running water when you wash dishes becomes a mindfulness bell. The whistle of the kettle becomes a call to presence. Your footsteps on the pavement become a rhythm for coming home to your body. As you develop this practice, you may notice that you need external reminders less and less. The capacity to pause and return to presence begins to arise naturally throughout your day. You find yourself taking conscious breaths at red lights without any external cue. You notice that you're naturally more present during conversations, more aware of your surroundings, more able to appreciate small beauties that you used to rush past. This is the flowering of what Buddhist teachers call continuous mindfulness, a state where awareness becomes so natural that you no longer have to work to maintain it. You're simply present, the way a tree is present, or a mountain, or the sky. This doesn't mean you become passive or lose your ability to think and plan. It means you do everything from a place of rootedness in the present moment, which makes all your actions more effective and less stressful. The bell practice is preparation for this natural state of awakeness. Each time you pause and listen deeply, you're watering the seeds of presence within your consciousness. Each time you choose to interrupt your mental busyness and come home to your breath, you're strengthening your capacity for the kind of peace that doesn't depend on external conditions. As we continue our journey together, we'll explore how this foundation of present moment awareness becomes the basis for transforming your most difficult emotions and breaking free from patterns that have held you captive for years. But for now, simply rest in the understanding that your true home is always available, as close as your next breath, as accessible as the next sound you hear. There's a profound truth that most of us spend our entire lives searching for, yet it remains hidden in plain sight. We believe that peace, belonging, and true contentment exist somewhere outside ourselves, in the perfect relationship, the ideal living situation, the right career, or perhaps in returning to a place from our past where we once felt safe and happy. But what if everything we've been taught about finding home is backwards? What if the very act of seeking happiness in external circumstances is what keeps us feeling displaced and restless? This understanding emerged from one of the most powerful stories of exile and discovery in modern spiritual history. A young teacher, deeply committed to serving his people and his country, found himself forced to leave everything familiar behind. What was meant to be a brief journey to share important truths with the world became a separation that lasted nearly 4 decades. Yet through this profound loss, he discovered something so valuable that it transformed not only his own life, but the lives of millions of people who would learn from his experience. In 1966, during one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century, this teacher received an invitation from Cornell University to give a series of lectures. His homeland was being torn apart by war, with brothers forced to kill brothers using foreign weapons and ideologies that had been imported from distant lands. The communists and anti-communists were both fighting with weapons that came from outside their country, urged on by foreign powers who had their own political agendas. In the midst of this madness, he and his community had started a movement with a simple message: don't shoot your brother. They represented the voice of ordinary people who didn't want the war, who could see through the artificial divisions being imposed by outside forces. But their calls for peace and reconciliation were silenced by both warring parties. Sometimes, the only way they could get the world's attention was through the most extreme sacrifice imaginable. Monks and nuns would burn themselves alive, not out of despair or hatred, but as acts of pure love, desperate attempts to wake people up to the tragedy of the violence. When the university invitation came, the teacher planned to stay in America for just 3 months. He would give his lectures, tour the country to share the truth about what was really happening in his homeland, and then return to continue his work with the school and university he had founded. All his friends, colleagues, and students were back home, depending on him. He had no intention of staying away for long. But 3 months turned into 3 years, then 10 years, then 20, then 38 years of exile. The government declared that his message of peace was harmful to the war effort and revoked his citizenship. He was told that if he returned, he would face imprisonment, or worse. The man who had only wanted to help his people find peace suddenly found himself cut off from everything he had ever known as home. During those early years of separation, despite being an accomplished teacher with deep understanding of spiritual principles, he discovered that intellectual knowledge wasn't enough to protect him from the profound disorientation of displacement. He would travel from city to city giving lectures, sleeping 1 or 2 nights in each place before moving on. Night after night, he would wake up in the darkness not knowing where he was. He would have to breathe deeply and slowly piece together his location. What city? What country? What continent? The constant movement and unfamiliarity were exhausting and deeply unsettling. But the most painful part wasn't the physical discomfort of constant travel. It was the recurring dream that visited him again and again. In the dream, he would be returning to his root temple in the central mountains of his homeland. He could see the familiar green hill rising before him, covered with the beautiful trees he had loved since childhood. In the dream, he would begin climbing the hill with a heart full of joy and anticipation, knowing that soon he would be back where he truly belonged. But every time, halfway up the hill, he would wake up. The crushing realization would hit him again. He was still in exile, still separated from everything that felt like home. The dream repeated with heartbreaking regularity, each time filling him with hope, only to dash it with the harsh reality of his situation. For someone who taught others about finding peace, the persistent pain of homesickness was both humbling and deeply challenging. During this period, he was incredibly active in trying to serve others despite his personal struggles. He made friends with Catholic priests, Protestant ministers, professors, and activists. He worked tirelessly to build bridges between different communities and to share wisdom that might help reduce suffering in the world. He played with German children, French children, African children, and British children, learning to find joy in connection across cultural boundaries. Yet beneath all this meaningful activity, the sense of displacement persisted. The trees in his new surroundings were so different from the trees of his homeland. The fruits, the flowers, the seasons, everything felt foreign and strange. The people, though kind and welcoming, spoke different languages and came from different cultural backgrounds. While he could appreciate the beauty and goodness in his new environment, nothing felt truly familiar or deeply nourishing to his soul. But then something began to shift through his practice of mindfulness and present moment awareness. He started to question the very foundation of his suffering. Was his pain really caused by being separated from a particular place, or was it caused by his attachment to the idea that he needed to be in that place to be truly at peace? This wasn't an intellectual exercise or philosophical speculation. It was a matter of survival, of finding a way to live with joy and purpose, despite circumstances that seemed to make happiness impossible. Through patient practice of returning his attention to the present moment, breathing mindfully, and observing his own mental patterns, he began to recognize something profound. His true home had never been a location on a map. It wasn't the building where he was born, the temple where he was trained, or even the country whose soil he loved. His true home was the state of being fully present, fully aware, fully alive in whatever moment he found himself experiencing. This realization didn't come all at once in a moment of dramatic enlightenment. It emerged gradually through the simple practice of saying to himself, with increasing conviction, "I have arrived. I am home." At first, these words felt hollow, like trying to convince himself of something that wasn't true. How could he have arrived when he was so far from where he wanted to be? How could he be home when everything around him was unfamiliar? But as he continued the practice, breathing in with, "I have arrived," and breathing out with, "I am home," something shifted in his understanding. He began to recognize that arrival isn't about reaching a destination. It's about becoming fully present wherever you are. Home isn't a place you travel to. It's a quality of awareness you can cultivate in any circumstances. The peace he had been seeking in external conditions was actually available in every moment through the simple act of paying complete attention to what was happening right here, right now. When this understanding became not just an idea but a lived reality, something remarkable happened. The dreams of climbing the green hill stopped coming. The sense of being a victim of his circumstances transformed into a recognition of his fundamental freedom. He could still feel love for his homeland and sadness about the separation, but these feelings no longer dominated his experience or prevented him from finding joy and meaning in his daily life. he realized that his true home had never been limited to any particular place or time. It wasn't Vietnam, though he loved Vietnam deeply. It wasn't France, where he had found refuge, or America, where he shared his teachings, or any other country where his work took him. His true home was the quality of presence and awareness that he could access wherever he happened to be. This home couldn't be taken away by governments, destroyed by wars, or lost through any external circumstances. This profound shift in understanding didn't make him passive or resigned to injustice. If anything, it made him more effective in his work for peace, because he was no longer acting from a place of personal desperation or victimhood. He could see that even those who had exiled him were not his enemies, but people caught in their own fear and conditioning. They were afraid that his message of reconciliation and brotherhood might threaten their hold on power. But he understood that they too were victims of the same forces of division and hatred that had torn his country apart. From this place of inner freedom, he could offer genuine compassion even to those who had caused him great suffering. He had no enemies because he understood that everyone, including those who opposed him, was struggling with the same fundamental human challenges: the search for security, the fear of loss, the desire to be loved and understood. His practice became not just about finding personal peace, but about helping others discover the same freedom from the prison of seeking happiness in external circumstances. This understanding has profound implications for how we approach our own struggles with belonging and contentment. How many of us spend our lives feeling like we're in the wrong place, with the wrong people, in the wrong circumstances? How much energy do we waste thinking that happiness will come when we finally get to the right location, achieve the right relationship status, or accumulate the right amount of wealth and security? The teaching of true home offers a radically different approach. Instead of constantly seeking better external conditions, we can learn to arrive fully in whatever conditions we find ourselves experiencing. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations that we have the power to change. It means developing the inner stability and clarity that allows us to respond to life's challenges from wisdom rather than desperation. You can practice this understanding right now, wherever you happen to be. Take a moment to breathe in deeply and say to yourself, "I have arrived." Notice that you don't need to be anywhere else to be fully present. Breathe out and say, "I am home." Notice that you don't need different circumstances to access the peace and awareness that are your birthright. This practice is particularly powerful when you're in situations that trigger your sense of displacement or dissatisfaction. Stuck in traffic, you can breathe mindfully and recognize that you have arrived in this moment of waiting. Standing in a long line, you can come home to your body and breath rather than mentally rushing toward the future. Lying awake at night worried about tomorrow, you can find refuge in the present moment rather than being tormented by imaginary scenarios. The practice deepens when you begin to understand how presence in the current moment actually heals both the past and the future. When you truly arrive in the here and now, you're not abandoning your history or giving up on your dreams. You're accessing the only place where real healing and positive change can ever occur. The past exists now only in your memory, and your relationship to those memories can be transformed through present moment awareness. The future exists now only in your imagination, and the quality of that future is being created by the choices you make in this moment. This understanding was tested and proven through decades of exile that might have broken someone with less inner resources. Instead of becoming bitter or defeated, the experience became a teaching that transformed millions of lives. People from every continent and culture began to learn that they too could find their true home regardless of their external circumstances. Whether they were refugees fleeing war, immigrants struggling to adapt to new countries, or simply individuals feeling displaced in their own familiar surroundings, they discovered that arrival and belonging were always available through the practice of presence. The most remarkable aspect of this teaching is how it transforms your relationship not just to place, but to time itself. Most of us live with a persistent sense that the good life is somewhere in the future, when we graduate, when we get married, when we retire, when our problems are finally solved. Or we believe that our happiest times are in the past, childhood, a former relationship, a time when we felt more hopeful or energetic. This constant mental time travel keeps us from ever fully inhabiting our lives. But when you learn to say, "I have arrived, I am home," with genuine understanding, you're acknowledging that your life is happening right now. Not in some imaginary future when conditions are perfect, not in some remembered past when things seemed easier, but in this moment, with all its imperfections and possibilities. This doesn't mean giving up on positive change or pretending that all circumstances are equally pleasant. It means recognizing that your capacity for peace, joy, and love doesn't depend on having perfect circumstances. The teacher who discovered this truth during his long exile often said that if he could return to his homeland, it would be a joy. He would love to offer teachings to the monks, nuns, and lay people there, to speak with artists and writers and young people about building a more peaceful society. But if he couldn't return, he didn't need to suffer. He could meet with people from other countries, China, Korea, Japan, Spain, England, Canada, and share the same wisdom that transcends all cultural and political boundaries. This perspective offers incredible freedom to anyone struggling with circumstances that seem to prevent happiness. You might be living far from family you love, working in a job that doesn't fully utilize your talents, or dealing with health challenges that limit your physical activities. While it's natural to wish for different circumstances and to work toward positive change when possible, your fundamental well-being doesn't have to depend on achieving those external goals. You can learn to find genuine contentment and purpose wherever life has placed you. The practice of arriving in the present moment also reveals something beautiful about the nature of time itself. When you're fully present, you discover that this moment contains everything you need. Not everything you want, necessarily, but everything you need to take the next step, to respond with wisdom, to experience peace and gratitude. The future unfolds naturally from present moment awareness and right action. The past finds healing through the forgiveness and understanding that can only happen now. This is why the formula, "I have arrived, I am home," became the essence of decades of spiritual practice and teaching. It's not a denial of difficulty or a form of spiritual bypassing. It's the recognition that your true nature, your capacity for awareness, love, wisdom, and peace is fully present and available right now. This true nature is what you are, not just what you have. It can't be damaged by external circumstances or lost through any kind of failure or misfortune. As you practice this understanding, you may notice that your relationship to travel and movement begins to change. Instead of always seeking escape from your current situation, you learn to bring a quality of presence and appreciation to wherever you are. When you do travel, it's not because you're running away from yourself, but because you're curious about experiencing your true home in different settings. The external journey becomes a reflection of an inner journey toward greater awareness and freedom. You might also notice that your relationships with other people deepen. When you're not constantly seeking fulfillment through external circumstances, you can be more genuinely present with others. You listen more deeply because you're not mentally elsewhere, planning your escape or waiting for something better. You love more freely because your happiness doesn't depend on others behaving in particular ways. This quality of presence is one of the greatest gifts you can offer to anyone, and it emerges naturally from the practice of coming home to yourself. The true home within is not a destination you reach after years of practice. It's your natural state that becomes accessible the moment you stop seeking fulfillment elsewhere. Every breath is an opportunity to arrive. Every moment is a chance to come home. The peace you've been seeking has been waiting patiently for you to notice that it was never anywhere except here, in the simple miracle of your own aware presence. As we continue exploring these teachings, you'll discover how this foundation of inner homecoming becomes the basis for transforming even the most difficult relationships and healing wounds that seemed permanent. But for now, rest in the understanding that wherever you are, whatever you're experiencing, you are already home. Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields with weapons, but in quiet moments when someone chooses love over hatred, understanding over revenge, compassion over the burning desire for justice. What you're about to hear are true stories from one of the most brutal conflicts of the 20th century, stories that reveal how ordinary people can become extraordinary warriors, not warriors who destroy, but warriors who heal, who build bridges where others see only division. These aren't tales of military strategy or political maneuvering. They're stories about what happens when the human heart refuses to be hardened by even the most extreme suffering. They're about discovering that your greatest enemy might actually be the person most in need of your compassion, and that the path to peace sometimes requires sacrifices that the world struggles to understand. In the 1960s, a beautiful country in Southeast Asia was being torn apart by forces that its people had never chosen. Foreign powers had drawn lines on maps, imported weapons, and brought competing ideologies that turned neighbors into enemies. Brothers were forced to kill brothers using guns and bombs that came from distant lands, fighting for causes that had been imposed upon them by people who would never face the consequences of the violence. The communist and anti-communist forces were both using imported weapons, Soviet AK-47s on one side, American M16s on the other, urged on by superpowers who saw this ancient land as nothing more than a chess piece in their global game. The tragedy wasn't just the physical destruction, though that was overwhelming. Villages were burned, families separated, ancient temples destroyed. Children grew up knowing only war, never experiencing the peace their grandparents remembered. But perhaps even more heartbreaking was the spiritual destruction, the way the conflict forced people to abandon their deepest values of compassion and harmony, replacing them with hatred and suspicion. In the midst of this madness, a group of monks, nuns, and lay people started a movement with a message so simple that children could understand it, yet so radical that it threatened everyone in power. They called it, "Don't shoot your brother." It wasn't a political slogan or a call to support one side over the other. It was a reminder of something fundamental that the war had made people forget, that the person wearing the enemy uniform was someone's son, someone's father, someone who had been born with the same capacity for love and suffering as themselves. They represented the voice of ordinary people who could see through the artificial divisions being imposed upon them. Rice farmers who had no interest in communist or capitalist ideology, but simply wanted to tend their fields in peace. Mothers who didn't care about geopolitical strategies but wanted their children to grow up without fear. Elderly people who remembered a time when neighbors helped each other during harvest season regardless of their political beliefs. Students who dreamed of building a more beautiful society rather than destroying the one they had inherited. But this voice of sanity was dangerous to those who needed the war to continue. Military contractors profited from the endless demand for weapons. Politicians built their careers on anti-communist rhetoric. Foreign powers used the conflict to advance their own strategic interests. The peace activists found themselves silenced by both sides of the conflict, treated as traitors by people who claimed to be fighting for their freedom. Their books and articles were banned by both the communists and the anti-communists. Their calls for reconciliation were seen as threats to the war effort. They discovered that in a world gone mad with violence, the most dangerous thing you can be is someone who refuses to choose between artificial sides. Someone who insists on seeing the humanity in all people, even those designated as enemies. The leader of this peace movement was a young monk who had founded a university and a school for social service. He had trained in traditional Buddhism, but believed that ancient wisdom needed to be applied to contemporary problems. He called this approach engaged Buddhism, a spirituality that didn't retreat from the world's suffering, but engaged with it directly, offering compassionate responses to war, injustice, poverty, and oppression. When ordinary methods of communication failed, when their voices were drowned out by the propaganda machines of both sides, some of these peaceful warriors made a choice that shook the world. They decided that if their voices couldn't be heard through words, they would speak through the ultimate sacrifice. This wasn't a decision made in anger or despair, but through deep meditation and careful preparation. They understood that their deaths would carry a message that no amount of censorship could silence. On a June morning in 1000, 963, an elderly monk named Thichquang Duc, who had been a close friend and mentor to the peace movement's leader, sat quietly in a busy intersection in the capital city. He had spent the previous days in intensive meditation, preparing his mind and heart for what he was about to do. He had said goodbye to his fellow monks, given final instructions about his funeral, and written letters to be read after his death. As fellow monks chanted prayers around him, creating a circle of spiritual protection, he poured gasoline over his robes and struck a match. The image of this monk burning himself alive appeared on the front page of newspapers around the world the next day. The young leader saw it on the front page of the New York Times while he was visiting America. The grief was overwhelming, not just personal grief for the loss of a beloved friend, but grief for a world that had become so deaf to the cries of suffering that only the most extreme sacrifice could get its attention. But what most people didn't understand was that this wasn't an act of despair or suicide in any conventional sense. It was an act of pure love, a desperate attempt to wake the world up to the suffering of his people. The monk had meditated deeply on his intention, ensuring that his heart was free from hatred or desire for revenge. He died not with curses on his lips, but with prayers for peace and forgiveness. His sacrifice was of the same nature as that of great spiritual teachers throughout history, who gave their lives not to destroy their enemies, but to save them from their own hatred and blindness. This understanding of self-sacrifice as an act of love rather than violence was central to the peace movement's philosophy. They saw a fundamental difference between killing others to advance your cause and sacrificing yourself to communicate a message of compassion. One adds more violence and hatred to the world, while the other offers the possibility of transformation through love. They understood that the monk's death was like Christ's crucifixion, a willingness to suffer in order to awaken others to the possibility of love. A young woman named Nut Chi Mai, who had been one of the first 6 members of a newly formed spiritual community called the Order of Interbeing, witnessed the impact of this sacrifice and felt called to follow the same path. She was a brilliant student, a gifted writer, and a devoted practitioner who had dedicated her life to serving others. She had watched the war escalate month by month, had seen the peace movement systematically silenced, and had come to believe that only the most extreme act of love could pierce through the world's indifference to her people's suffering. She was particularly close to Sister Chan Kong, who would later become one of the most important teachers in the global mindfulness movement. The 2 young women had worked together on projects to help war orphans and refugees, spending long hours discussing how to apply Buddhist principles to the practical work of relieving suffering. Nut Chi Mai's decision to sacrifice her life wasn't made in isolation, but through deep dialogue with her spiritual community about how to respond to evil with good. On a quiet morning before dawn, she made her way to Tuniem Temple, one of the most ancient and sacred sites in the capital. She had chosen this location carefully, knowing that the symbolism would be important. The temple represented the spiritual heritage that was being destroyed by the war, the wisdom traditions that both sides claimed to be defending while actually betraying. She placed a statue of the Virgin Mary alongside a statue of Kuan Yin, the Buddhist figure of compassion, symbolizing her belief that all authentic spiritual traditions point toward the same truth of universal love. She had spent weeks writing letters that she left behind as her final testament. One was addressed to the President of North Vietnam, another to the President of South Vietnam. Others were written to world leaders, religious figures, and ordinary citizens. Each letter called for the same thing: an end to the killing, a commitment to dialogue and reconciliation, a recognition that the people of this beautiful country deserve to live in peace. Her final letter was to her teacher, who was traveling abroad trying to build international support for peace. Then, like her spiritual elder before her, she poured gasoline over her robes and lit the flame that would carry her message to the world. She died as she had lived, with a heart full of compassion, calling for understanding rather than revenge, love rather than hatred. Her sacrifice represented the voice of an entire generation of young people who saw their futures being destroyed by conflicts they had never chosen. Her teacher, who had been in New York working with peace activists and religious leaders, learned of her sacrifice while reading the morning newspaper. The grief was devastating. This brilliant young woman who had shown such promise for bringing healing to the world, who had been like a sister to his closest disciple, was gone. But even in her final letter to him, she had tried to comfort her teacher, writing, "Tai, don't worry, peace will come. Don't suffer too much, don't worry." Even as she prepared to die, she was thinking of others, trying to ease their pain. These acts of self-sacrifice created a moral crisis for the world. How do you respond to people who die not to kill their enemies, but to save them? How do you ignore a message delivered at such an ultimate cost? The international media struggled to categorize these deaths, calling them suicide when they were actually the opposite, acts of extreme love for life itself. The teacher understood that the world needed to hear not just about the sacrifices being made, but about the philosophy behind them. He began writing and speaking about the understanding that violence only creates more violence, that hatred only breeds more hatred, that the cycle of suffering can only be broken through acts of radical love. This message needed to reach beyond the borders of his own country to touch people everywhere who were struggling with the question of how to respond to injustice without perpetuating it. This understanding led to one of the most significant encounters in the modern peace movement. Exactly 1 year before meeting him in person, the teacher had written a detailed letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., explaining why monks and nuns were burning themselves alive. It wasn't suicide in the conventional sense, he explained, but an act of love designed to communicate what couldn't be communicated any other way. The letter described how these sacrifices were made without anger or hatred, with the same spirit that motivated Jesus Christ's death on the cross, a willingness to suffer in order to wake others up to love. The letter was carefully crafted, written by someone who understood that Dr. King would face criticism for opposing the war. It explained the connections between the struggle for civil rights in America and the struggle for peace in Southeast Asia. Both movements were fighting against the same fundamental problem, the human tendency to solve conflicts through violence and oppression rather than understanding and justice. Both were challenging systems that treated some human beings as less worthy of dignity and respect than others. On June 1, 1966, exactly 1 year after sending that letter, the two men met in Chicago. The encounter took place at a time when Dr. King was facing intense pressure from both the government and some of his own supporters not to speak out against the war. Many civil rights leaders believed that opposing the war would alienate President Johnson and jeopardize progress on domestic issues. But Dr. King had been deeply moved by the letter and wanted to understand more about this monk's perspective on nonviolence. They talked for hours about the connections between racism and militarism, about the spiritual roots of social justice work, about the challenges of maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming violence. They discovered that they shared not just political views, but a deep spiritual understanding that lasting change could only come through transformation of consciousness, not through defeating enemies. They recognized that they were fighting different manifestations of the same fundamental problem, the illusion that some human beings are expendable. After their private conversation, they met with the press together, and that very day, Dr. King publicly came out against the war. It was a moment when two great movements for human dignity joined forces, when the struggle for peace abroad and the fight for civil rights at home became one unified effort. The teacher later said that from that day forward, their work was inseparable. You cannot fight against racism while supporting war, because both arise from the same root of seeing others as enemies rather than brothers and sisters. 2 years later, they met again at a conference in Geneva, organized by the World Council of Churches. The gathering brought together religious leaders, peace activists, and social justice advocates from around the world. Among the participants was Linus Pauling, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist who had become a prominent voice for nuclear disarmament. The teacher was staying on the 4th floor of the hotel, while Dr. King was on the 11th floor. Despite his incredibly busy schedule and the constant demands on his time, Dr. King personally invited his friend up for breakfast. When the teacher arrived late because he had been delayed by reporters wanting interviews, he found that Dr. King had kept the breakfast warm for him. This simple act of kindness spoke volumes about the character of this great leader. In the midst of his world-changing work, he still had time for personal gestures that honored friendship and showed care for individual people. It was the kind of attention to small acts of love that both men understood was essential to any movement for justice. During that breakfast, the teacher told Dr. King something that would prove to be prophetic and deeply meaningful. "Martin," he said, "you know something. In my country, they call you a bodhisattva." A bodhisattva, he explained, is an enlightened being who has achieved liberation from suffering, but chooses to remain in the world to help others find their way to freedom and understanding. It's someone who could escape from the difficulties of life, but stays to serve those who are still struggling. The title was particularly meaningful because it recognized Dr. King not just as a political leader or social activist, but as a spiritual teacher whose work was transforming consciousness. It acknowledged that his commitment to nonviolence came not from political strategy, but from deep spiritual understanding. The teacher was grateful he had the chance to share this insight, because just a few months later, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. The world lost not just a civil rights leader, but a bodhisattva, someone whose presence had made liberation more possible for everyone. These connections with the American civil rights movement were part of a larger effort to build an international community of people committed to non-violent social change. But the teacher and his colleagues faced enormous obstacles in their work, obstacles that revealed the extent to which governments feared their message of peace and reconciliation. They had established an office in Paris to represent the voices of ordinary people who had no political power, whose perspectives were never heard in the international media. The office was located in a poor quarter of the city, number 11 of a street mainly inhabited by people of Arab origin, symbolizing their solidarity with all marginalized communities. Every time the teacher applied for a visa to travel to America or England to share these perspectives, his application was automatically denied. The process became so predictable that he knew, before applying, that he would be rejected. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun eventually told him that there was an official dispatch from the capital city asking the governments of the United States, France, England, and Japan not to honor his passport because he had been saying things that were not helpful to the war efforts against communism. The irony was devastating. A monk whose only crime was calling for peace was treated as a security threat by the very governments that claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy. His message of reconciliation and brotherhood was seen as more dangerous than the actual weapons that were destroying his homeland. The peace activists were monitored, their communications intercepted, their movements restricted, while arms dealers and war profiteers operated freely. The only way he could get permission to travel was through the intervention of powerful politicians who would write personal letters of invitation. Senators like George McGovern and Robert Kennedy would have to write saying, "Dear friend, I need to learn more about the situation in your country. Please come and inform me about what's really happening. If you have difficulties with your visa, please call me at this number." Only with such letters from high-ranking officials could he obtain the documents necessary to share his message of peace with American audiences. Even with these high-level interventions, travel remained dangerous and humiliating. On one particularly memorable occasion, flying from Tokyo to Paris via Seattle and New York, he was detained at the Seattle airport without explanation. Immigration officials took his passport and locked him in a room where he couldn't contact anyone or communicate with the outside world. The walls were covered with wanted posters featuring the faces of criminals and terrorists, as if he were a dangerous fugitive rather than a monk whose only weapon was compassion. He spent hours in that room, surrounded by images of violence and criminality, meditating on the fear and confusion that could make officials treat a peace advocate as a threat to national security. He was held there until just before his connecting flight was due to leave, then released without explanation or apology. The message was clear. He was being watched, his movements monitored, his influence contained. Speaking for peace was dangerous work in a world committed to war. These experiences of being treated as a threat to national security for advocating peace taught him something profound about the nature of fear and enemies. He began to see that the people who were oppressing him and silencing his message were not evil monsters, but human beings caught in their own fear and confusion. They were afraid that his message of reconciliation and brotherhood might threaten their power, their sense of security, their entire worldview. They were victims of the same forces of hatred and division that were tearing his homeland apart. This understanding led to one of the most radical insights in all of spiritual teaching, the recognition that our enemies are not our enemies, but people who need our help. The officials who had exiled him, who had banned his books, who had tried to silence his voice, they were not people to be hated or defeated, but people to be healed. They were suffering from the same spiritual disease that makes war seem necessary, the inability to see other human beings as worthy of love and respect. They were prisoners of their own fear, and like all prisoners, they deserved compassion rather than condemnation. This perspective didn't make him passive or resigned to injustice. If anything, it made him more effective in his work for peace because he was no longer motivated by anger or the desire for revenge. He could respond to oppression with clarity and wisdom rather than reactive emotion. He understood that lasting change could only come through transformation of consciousness, not through defeating enemies or winning political battles. He often reflected on how difficult it had been for peace activists to voice their concerns during the war. Most of the people in his country didn't want the war, but they had no access to mass media, no way to make their voices heard above the propaganda of both sides. The peace movement represented the silent majority, but they were the least powerful voices in the conversation about their own country's future. Military leaders, politicians, and foreign advisors dominated the narrative, while ordinary people who bore the cost of the violence had no platform to speak. The teacher's poetry from this period, which he preferred to call peace poetry rather than anti-war poetry, was condemned by the North and confiscated by the South. Both sides saw his message of reconciliation as a threat to their cause. He was calling people to remember their common humanity at a time when political forces needed them to see each other as enemies. His crime was refusing to choose between the artificial divisions that had been imposed upon his people. He insisted on seeing Vietnamese people as one family, regardless of which political system they lived under. This experience of being caught in the middle, rejected by both sides of a conflict, taught him something that became central to all his teaching. He learned that the path of peace often means accepting misunderstanding and rejection from people who think you should choose their side. It means being willing to be seen as naive or idealistic by those who have given up on the possibility of solving problems without violence. It means standing for principles that transcend the immediate political pressures of any particular moment. It means having the courage to be criticized by everyone, while serving the truth that lives beyond all partial perspectives. But perhaps most importantly, it means developing the inner strength to continue loving even when that love is not returned, not understood, not appreciated. The teacher discovered that this kind of unconditional love isn't weakness, it's the strongest force in the universe. It's what allows people to keep working for justice and peace, even when their efforts seem to have no immediate effect. It's what prevents activists from becoming bitter or cynical when the world doesn't change as quickly as they hope. It's what sustains movements for positive change across generations. Years later, when political changes finally allowed him to return to his homeland for visits, he was asked whether he felt angry about the decades of separation, the missed opportunities, the suffering that could have been prevented if his voice had been heard earlier. His response revealed the depth of his transformation through those painful years. He felt no anger, no desire for revenge, no bitterness toward those who had caused his exile. Instead, he felt gratitude for the opportunity to share these teachings with people around the world, to plant seeds of peace in many different cultures and contexts. He had learned that suffering, when met with wisdom and compassion, becomes a gift not just to the person who suffers, but to everyone whose life they touch. The pain of separation from his homeland had taught him that true belonging isn't geographical but spiritual. The experience of being silenced had taught him new ways to communicate that reach deeper than political rhetoric. The rejection by both sides of the conflict had freed him to serve a higher cause that transcended all political divisions. What had seemed like the greatest tragedy of his life had become the source of his greatest service to humanity. This is the ultimate teaching of the warrior of peace, that our greatest enemies often become our greatest teachers. The people who cause us suffering are offering us the opportunity to develop qualities we never knew we possessed: patience, forgiveness, understanding, unconditional love. They are challenging us to find sources of strength and peace that don't depend on external validation or favorable circumstances. They are forcing us to discover the unshakable foundation of our own true nature. When you understand this deeply, it changes everything about how you respond to conflict in your own life. That family member who constantly criticizes you, that coworker who takes credit for your ideas, that neighbor who plays music too loud, that political leader whose policies you despise, they're not enemies to be defeated, but teachers, offering you the chance to practice patience and compassion. That doesn't mean accepting abuse or failing to set appropriate boundaries. It means responding from wisdom rather than reactive emotion, from love rather than fear, from understanding rather than judgment. The stories from this war teach us that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of understanding. It's the recognition that everyone, including those who seem to be your enemies, is struggling with the same fundamental human needs for security, love, and meaning. When you can see the fear and pain underneath someone's aggressive behavior, you naturally respond with compassion rather than counter-aggression. This doesn't guarantee that they'll change their behavior, but it guarantees that you won't add more hatred and division to an already troubled world. And sometimes, miraculously, your refusal to respond with hatred creates the space for transformation to occur. As we continue this journey together, you'll discover how this understanding becomes practical in dealing with your own difficult emotions and relationships. You'll learn the specific techniques that allow you to respond to anger with mindfulness, to fear with courage, to hatred with love. But for now, rest in the recognition that every person who challenges you is offering you the opportunity to become a warrior of peace yourself, someone who responds to hatred with love, to fear with understanding, to division with the recognition of our shared humanity. Now we come to perhaps the most practical and transformative teaching in all of Buddhist psychology: how to work with the energy of anger when it arises within you. This isn't about suppressing anger or pretending it doesn't exist, nor is it about expressing it in ways that harm yourself or others. It's about discovering a completely different relationship with this powerful emotion, one that transforms both the anger itself and your understanding of who you really are. Most of us have been taught to think of anger as either good or bad, something to fight against or something to let out. But Buddhist psychology offers a third way, one that's so simple it can be practiced by a child, yet so profound it can heal patterns that have been passed down through generations. This understanding emerged from a story that perfectly illustrates how inherited emotional patterns can be transformed through the practice of mindful awareness. There was a young boy who would visit a peaceful monastery each summer with his younger sister. Both children were eager to learn the practices of mindfulness that could bring more peace to their daily lives. But this boy carried a heavy burden that many children understand all too well. He had learnt to expect anger instead of comfort when he was hurt or in need. The pattern was heartbreakingly consistent and familiar to anyone who has lived with reactive family dynamics. Whenever this boy would fall down and hurt himself while playing, instead of receiving the comfort and care that a child naturally needs, his father would immediately respond with irritation and blame. "How could you be so careless?" his father would demand. "Why weren't you paying attention to where you were going?" The boy would stand there, perhaps bleeding from a scraped knee or nursing a bruised elbow, feeling not only the physical pain, but also the deeper wound of being criticized when he most needed compassion. Year after year, this young boy made himself a solemn promise that burned in his heart like a sacred vow. When he grew up and had children of his own, he would never ever respond to their pain with anger and blame the way his father had done. If his child fell down and got hurt, he wouldn't shout or criticize. He would rush to offer comfort, tend to their wounds, and make everything better with loving care. This determination lived in him like a flame of hope, fueling his commitment to break the cycle of harsh responses that had caused him so much confusion and pain. This boy's intention was beautiful and sincere, representing the natural desire of every generation to do better than the one before. But what he discovered during his time at the monastery would forever change his understanding of how inherited patterns actually work and how they can be transformed. The lesson came not through lectures or books, but through a moment of startling self-recognition that revealed the difference between our intentions and our conditioning. One particular summer day at the monastery, the boy was playing peacefully when his sister and another little girl decided to enjoy themselves on a rope hammock that hung between two trees. Children being children, they were laughing and swinging, lost in the simple joy of the moment, completely absorbed in their play. The day was beautiful, the monastery was peaceful, and there seemed to be nothing in the world except happiness and innocence. But then something went wrong, as things sometimes do despite our best intentions and careful planning. The other girl somehow lost her balance and fell from the hammock, hitting the ground with a painful thud Blood immediately began to flow from her injury, bright red against her pale skin, and she began to cry with the sharp, urgent sound that comes from real hurt rather than mere disappointment. What happened next in the boy's mind and heart changed everything he thought he knew about himself and his capacity to be different from his father. As he saw the injured girl lying there bleeding and crying, instead of rushing to help with the compassion and gentleness he had always promised himself he would show, he felt a sudden and powerful surge of anger rising in his chest like a hot wave. The words that wanted to burst from his mouth were shockingly, devastatingly familiar. Stupid! How could you do something like that? In that moment of crisis, all his good intentions and years of promising himself he would be different simply evaporated. The reactive pattern that had shaped his childhood was arising in him with the same intensity and judgment that had wounded him so deeply when he was the one who needed help. He discovered something that shook him to his very core. Despite all his promises and determination, he was exactly like his father. But here's where the story becomes truly remarkable, and where the power of mindfulness practice reveals itself. Because this boy had been learning the art of present moment awareness during his time at the monastery, he was able to catch himself before the harsh words actually left his mouth. He had developed enough conscious awareness to recognize what was happening inside him. The same pattern of blame and irritation that had hurt him so deeply was now rising in him, ready to hurt someone else in exactly the same way. This wasn't a heroic moment of great spiritual achievement. It was simply the natural result of practicing mindfulness, which had given him the capacity to observe his mental and emotional patterns without being completely swept away by them. Instead of speaking from his anger, he stepped back and watched as other people came to help the injured girl, his heart pounding with the recognition of what he had almost done. Following the walking meditation practice he had learned at the monastery, he began to walk slowly and mindfully, breathing deeply to calm his nervous system and create space for understanding to arise. With each conscious step and each mindful breath, a profound realization began to dawn in his young mind. He wasn't fundamentally different from his father at all. The same energy of anger and impatience that had been expressed toward him was now living inside him, ready to be passed on to the next generation if he didn't learn to transform it. As he continued his walking meditation, breathing in awareness and breathing out understanding, he began to see something that completely changed his relationship to his family history. His father hadn't been a monster or a fundamentally bad person who chose to hurt his children. His father had also been carrying inherited patterns of reactivity, probably passed down from his own father and his father's father before that, stretching back through generations of people who never learned a different way to respond to their own pain and frustration. This insight completely transformed how the boy felt about his childhood experiences and his relationship with his father. Instead of seeing himself as a victim of his father's harsh treatment, he began to understand that both he and his father were victims of what Buddhism calls habit energy, deeply ingrained patterns of reaction that get transmitted from generation to generation unless someone learns to recognize and transform them. These patterns operate below the level of conscious choice, which is why people can have the best intentions but still find themselves repeating the same reactions that hurt them when they were children. The boy realized that if he didn't learn to work with his own inherited patterns through mindfulness practice, he would inevitably pass them on to his future children, perpetuating the same cycle of hurt that had caused him so much confusion and pain. But he also saw something hopeful and empowering, that by learning to respond differently, by practicing awareness and compassion, he could heal not only his own future, but somehow reach back to heal the ancestors who had carried these same struggling patterns without knowing how to transform them. When that intention to practice and transform was born in his heart, something beautiful and unexpected happened. His anger and resentment toward his father simply melted away like ice in warm sunlight. It was replaced by a deep desire to go home and tell his father, "I have discovered that I have the same kind of reactive energy in me that you do, and I want us to practice together so we can both be free from these patterns that have caused so much suffering." This young person, through one moment of clear seeing and mindful awareness, had discovered the path to healing that extends in both directions, toward the future and toward the past. He had learned that transformation happens not through fighting against our difficult patterns, but through understanding them so deeply that they lose their power to control our responses. This is the essence of what Buddhism calls mindfulness of anger, a practice that can liberate not just individuals, but entire family lines from cycles of reactive suffering. To understand how this transformation works, we need to explore what Buddhist psychology teaches about the nature of consciousness itself. According to this ancient wisdom, our consciousness has different layers, like a vast lake with depths that extend far below what we can see on the surface. The upper layer is called mind consciousness. This is where we experience our moment-to-moment thoughts, emotions, and reactions to life. It's the level of awareness where we plan and worry, remember and imagine, react and respond to whatever is happening around us. But beneath this surface layer lies what's known as store consciousness, the deeper realm where all our experiences, memories, and inherited patterns are held like seeds, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. This is where the boy's pattern of angry response to injury had been stored since he was very small, probably from the first time his father had reacted with irritation instead of comfort when he was hurt. Every subsequent experience of this kind had strengthened the pattern, making it more likely to arise automatically when similar conditions appeared. Buddhism teaches that we all carry many different seeds in this store consciousness. There's a seed of anger there, yes, but there's also a seed of compassion. There's a seed of fear, but equally present is a seed of courage. There's a seed of judgment and criticism, but also growing quietly is a seed of acceptance and understanding. Which seeds grow into full mental and emotional experiences depends on which ones receive water, sunlight, and attention through our choices and mental habits. When the boy saw the injured girl and felt anger arise, what was happening was that his seed of anger had been touched by the situation and had sprouted into what Buddhism calls a mental formation, a temporary arising of emotional energy in his mind consciousness. This is completely natural and not a sign of spiritual failure or moral weakness. We all have these seeds of difficult emotions within us, and they will arise from time to time when conditions trigger them. The question isn't whether we have anger or other challenging emotions. The question is how we relate to them when they appear. This is where the practice of mindfulness becomes revolutionary. Instead of immediately acting from the angry mental formation or trying to suppress it through willpower, mindfulness gives us the capacity to recognize what's arising and to respond consciously rather than reactively. The boy was able to say to himself, "I see that anger is arising in me right now. This is the same pattern that my father carried. I don't have to act from this pattern or be controlled by it." The practice of mindfulness of anger begins with simple recognition, breathing in, "I know that anger is in me." Breathing out, "I take good care of my anger." This isn't about judging the anger as wrong or trying to make it disappear. It's about acknowledging what's present with the same kind attention you might give to a crying child. Buddhist teaching offers a beautiful metaphor that illustrates how to work with difficult emotions skillfully. Imagine a mother who is working peacefully in her kitchen when she suddenly hears her baby crying in the next room. She very much cares for her baby, so she immediately stops what she's doing and goes to the child's room. The first thing she does is pick up the baby and hold him tenderly in her arms, offering comfort and presence before she even knows what's wrong. The mother doesn't know yet whether the baby is hungry, sick, uncomfortable, or just needing attention. But her first response is always to offer loving presence and care. She doesn't scold the baby for crying or try to immediately fix the problem. She simply holds the child with mindfulness and tenderness, and this loving attention itself often brings relief and comfort. This is exactly how we can learn to work with our own difficult emotions. When anger arises, instead of immediately trying to analyze it, express it, or get rid of it, we can first offer it the same tender attention that a loving mother gives to her crying child. We can say to ourselves, "I see that you're here, anger. I'm going to hold you with care and try to understand what you need." As the mother continues to hold her baby with mindful attention, she naturally begins to understand what's wrong. Maybe the baby is hungry and needs to be fed. Maybe his diaper is uncomfortable and needs to be changed. Maybe he's overtired and needs help settling down to sleep. Once she understands the root of the problem, she can address it skillfully and effectively. In the same way, when we hold our anger with mindful compassion, we often discover what it's really about. The anger might be protecting something we care about deeply. It might be pointing to a boundary that's been crossed. It might be masking hurt feelings or fear that we haven't acknowledged. When we listen to anger with curiosity rather than judgment, it often reveals important information about our needs, values, and areas where healing is needed. The key to this practice is understanding that we don't transform ourselves into a battlefield where the good parts fight against the bad parts. That's not Buddhism, and it's not effective psychology. Instead, we learn to see mindfulness as like a big sister who holds and comforts a younger sister who is upset and struggling. Mindfulness doesn't fight against anger. It embraces anger with understanding and helps it transform naturally through the power of conscious attention. This approach requires developing what Buddhism calls the energy of mindfulness, the capacity to be present with whatever is arising without being overwhelmed by it. This energy is cultivated through practices like mindful breathing and walking meditation, which train the mind to stay present and centered, even when difficult emotions are moving through us. The more we practice these foundational skills, the stronger our capacity becomes to work skillfully with challenging mental and emotional states. Buddhist psychology identifies 51 different categories of mental formations, different types of thoughts and emotions that can arise in consciousness. Some of these are wholesome mental formations like compassion, gratitude, and equanimity. Others are unwholesome mental formations like anger, jealousy, and discrimination. The practice isn't about eliminating the unwholesome ones and keeping only the wholesome ones. It's about learning to work with all mental formations skillfully, transforming the energy of unwholesome states into wisdom and compassion. When we understand that anger is simply energy that has become temporarily stuck in a particular pattern, we can learn to work with that energy rather than being controlled by it. The boy at the monastery discovered that his anger toward his father was actually love that had become distorted by hurt and misunderstanding. When he could see his father as someone who was also carrying inherited patterns rather than as an enemy who had deliberately chosen to hurt him, the anger naturally transformed into compassion and a desire for mutual healing. This transformation didn't happen through forcing or willpower, but through the natural process of clear seeing that mindfulness makes possible. When we really understand the causes and conditions that give rise to our difficult emotions, they begin to lose their grip on us. We stop taking them so personally and start seeing them as impersonal patterns that arise and pass away according to natural laws. This perspective creates the space for wise response rather than unconscious reaction. The practice of mindfulness of anger can be cultivated in daily life whenever this emotion arises. The moment you notice anger beginning to build, perhaps as tension in your jaw, heat in your chest, or harsh thoughts towards someone, you can pause and breathe mindfully. Instead of immediately acting on the anger or trying to push it away, you can say to yourself, "Anger is here. I see you, and I'm going to take care of you." Then you can continue breathing mindfully while holding space for the emotion to be present without letting it drive your actions. Often, if you can stay present with anger for just a few minutes without feeding it with more angry thoughts or suppressing it with resistance, it will naturally begin to reveal its deeper message and transform into something more workable. This practice extends far beyond individual healing to the healing of relationships and even entire family systems. When you can respond to others' anger with mindfulness rather than reactivity, you create the possibility for transformation to occur, not just in yourself, but in the people around you. Instead of escalating conflicts through reactive responses, you become a source of peace and understanding that can interrupt cycles of hurt and retaliation. The young boy's story shows us that this healing can reach both forward and backward through time. When he transformed his own angry patterns through mindful awareness, he was ensuring that these patterns wouldn't be passed on to his future children. But somehow, through the mysterious interconnectedness of life, His healing also brought peace to the ancestors who had carried these same struggles without knowing how to transform them. This is the profound promise of mindfulness practice, that individual transformation ripples out to heal not just our immediate relationships, but the entire web of connections that extends through past and future generations. Every moment of conscious response rather than unconscious reaction adds to the collective reservoir of wisdom and compassion that's available to all beings. Every time we choose to hold our anger with mindful compassion, rather than expressing it harmfully or suppressing it unhealthily, we're participating in the healing of the world. There's a moment in every person's life when they have the opportunity to look honestly in the mirror and see not just themselves, but the long line of ancestors whose patterns and struggles live on through them. This moment of recognition can be devastating or liberating, depending on whether we meet it with judgment or compassion. What you're about to discover is how one young person's moment of startling self-recognition became a doorway to healing that reached both backward, through generations of inherited pain, and forward, into a future free from cycles of unconscious suffering. The boy at the monastery had reached that crucial moment during his walking meditation after witnessing his own reactive anger toward the injured girl. As he continued to breathe mindfully and walk slowly through the peaceful grounds, allowing his nervous system to settle and his mind to clear, a profound understanding began to emerge that would change everything about how he saw himself, his father, and the nature of family patterns. He began to recognize something that Buddhist psychology calls continuation. The understanding that we are not separate, isolated individuals who spring into existence from nowhere, but rather living expressions of all the experiences, patterns, and energies that have been passed down through our family lines. He started to see that he was literally a continuation of his father, carrying not just physical genes, but emotional and mental patterns that had been transmitted through countless interactions and examples. This wasn't an abstract philosophical concept, but a lived realization that he could feel in his body and mind. The energy of anger that had arisen when he saw the injured girl wasn't really his anger in any personal sense. It was the same energy that had been moving through his family line, perhaps for generations. His father's harsh reactions to childhood injuries probably came from his father's father, who had learned it from his father before him, stretching back through a long line of people who had never discovered a different way to respond to their own pain and overwhelm. The Buddhist teaching calls this habit energy, patterns of reaction that become so deeply ingrained they operate below the level of conscious choice. These patterns get transmitted not through formal teaching, but through countless small moments of modeling and response. Every time his father had reacted with irritation instead of comfort when he was hurt, that pattern was being passed on, stored in the boy's developing nervous system as the normal way adults respond to children's pain. But what made this realization truly transformative, rather than simply depressing, was the boy's growing understanding that he and his father were both victims of this inherited pattern. His father hadn't chosen to be harsh any more than the boy had chosen to carry anger toward injured people. They were both caught in what Buddhism calls samsara, the cycle of unconscious suffering that continues until someone develops enough awareness to interrupt it. This shift in perspective was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. Instead of seeing his father as someone who had deliberately chosen to hurt him, the boy began to see his father as someone who was also suffering under the weight of inherited patterns he had never learned to transform. His father's irritation and blame probably came from his own childhood experiences of not receiving comfort when he was hurt, and from the overwhelming stress of trying to protect and provide for his family without adequate emotional resources. When the boy could see his father as a fellow victim rather than as an enemy, something miraculous happened in his heart. The anger and resentment that had lived there for years simply began to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of compassion and understanding. He found himself thinking, "My father has been carrying this burden of reactive patterns his whole life. How much he must have suffered, never knowing how to respond differently. How lonely he must have felt, trapped in reactions he couldn't control." This compassionate understanding didn't excuse harmful behavior or suggest that children should simply accept poor treatment. Rather, it offered a perspective that could heal the wounds of the past while creating the possibility for a different future. The boy realized that his father's harsh reactions had come from pain and overwhelm, not from lack of love. His father had probably wanted to be a good parent, but simply didn't have the tools or awareness to respond differently when his own stress and inherited patterns were triggered. With this understanding came a profound desire for liberation, not just for himself, but for his father and for all the ancestors who had carried these same struggling patterns without knowing how to transform them. The boy began to see that if he could learn to respond differently through mindfulness practice, he could break the chain of unconscious transmission and ensure that future generations wouldn't have to carry these same burdens. But even more remarkably, he sensed that somehow his healing could reach backward as well as forward. Buddhist teaching speaks of the mysterious interconnectedness of all life, suggesting that when we transform our own patterns through conscious awareness, that transformation ripples out to touch everyone whose life has intersected with ours. The ancestors who had carried these same struggles without resolution could somehow find peace through the healing work of their descendants. This understanding gave birth to a beautiful intention in the boy's heart. Instead of wanting to escape from his family or prove that he was different from his father, he found himself longing to go home and say, "Dad, I've discovered that I have the same kind of reactive energy in me that you do. I don't blame you for it anymore because I can see that you inherited it just like I did. But I've also learned that there are practices that can help us both be free from these patterns. Would you like to practice together so we can both find peace?" This shift from blame to compassion, from separation to connection, represents one of the most profound healings possible in human relationships. Instead of perpetuating cycles of hurt through resentment and distance, the boy had discovered how to transform inherited pain into shared liberation. He had learned that the very patterns that seemed to divide him from his father could actually become bridges to deeper understanding and mutual healing. The practical implications of this understanding extend far beyond individual family dynamics. When we can see ourselves and others as products of countless inherited influences rather than as autonomous agents who choose their reactions freely, it naturally gives rise to compassion rather than judgment. That coworker who always seems defensive, that neighbor who reacts with suspicion to friendly overtures, that family member who can't seem to express appreciation. They're all carrying patterns they inherited rather than chose. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful behavior without boundaries. Rather, it means responding to difficult patterns with the understanding that they arise from suffering rather than malice. When someone reacts with anger or criticism, we can remember that they're expressing inherited pain rather than their deepest truth. This perspective naturally evokes patience and compassion rather than counter-reactivity. The Buddhist teaching about breaking generational patterns also reveals something profound about the nature of time and healing. We usually think of time as linear. The past is finished and gone, the future hasn't happened yet, and healing can only affect what comes next. But according to Buddhist understanding, when we transform our inherited patterns through mindful awareness, that transformation somehow reaches across time to heal wounds that seemed permanently sealed in the past. This isn't mystical thinking, but recognition of how deeply interconnected our lives really are. The ancestors who carried these patterns without resolution live on not just in our genes, but in our nervous systems, our emotional responses, our unconscious beliefs about how life works. When we heal these patterns within ourselves, we're healing not just our own suffering, but the suffering of everyone who contributed to our becoming. The boy's story illustrates how this healing process actually works in practice. Through his mindfulness practice, he was able to recognize the inherited pattern of angry response when it arose in him. Instead of being controlled by it or judging himself for having it, he could observe it with compassionate awareness. This created space between the triggering situation and his response, space where conscious choice became possible. In that space of mindful awareness, the pattern began to lose its automatic power. The boy could feel the familiar energy of irritation and blame arising, but he no longer had to act from it. He could recognize it as an old pattern, seeking expression, and choose instead to respond with care and helpfulness. Each time he made this conscious choice, the pattern weakened, and his capacity for compassionate response grew stronger. This process of pattern transformation through mindful awareness has profound implications for how we understand responsibility and blame in relationships. When someone hurts us through their unconscious patterns, we can hold two truths simultaneously. They are responsible for their actions, and they are also victims of forces largely beyond their conscious control. This perspective opens the door to accountability without demonization, healing without denial. The boy's realization that he was a continuation of his father also reveals something beautiful about the nature of family love. Beneath all the surface conflicts and inherited patterns, there's a deeper current of connection that can never be broken. The very patterns that seem to divide us from our family members are actually evidence of how deeply we've absorbed their influence, how much we matter to each other. When we can see inherited patterns as expressions of connection rather than sources of separation, family relationships can become opportunities for mutual liberation rather than ongoing battlegrounds. This understanding transforms how we approach the work of personal healing and growth. Instead of trying to become completely different from our families of origin, we can learn to transform the patterns we've inherited while honoring the love and struggle that shaped us. We can recognize that our parents and ancestors did the best they could with the resources and awareness available to them, while also taking responsibility for doing better with the greater understanding we've been fortunate to receive. The practice of breaking generational patterns requires both self-compassion and determination. We need compassion for the fact that we carry patterns we didn't choose, and determination to transform them through conscious practice. This isn't about perfectionism or never making mistakes, but about developing the capacity to recognize unconscious patterns when they arise and respond from awareness rather than automaticity. Buddhist psychology teaches that this transformation happens naturally when we can observe our mental and emotional patterns with what they call bare awareness, seeing them clearly without adding layers of judgment, story, or identification. When the boy could observe his anger arising without thinking, "I am an angry person," or "this anger is wrong," the pattern began to lose its grip on his identity and behavior. He could see it as a temporary weather pattern moving through the sky of his consciousness, rather than as a permanent feature of who he was. This perspective also offers hope for healing relationships that seem permanently damaged by years of mutual reactivity. When family members can recognize that they've all been caught in inherited patterns rather than choosing to hurt each other deliberately, conversations become possible that seemed impossible before. The boy's desire to invite his father into shared practice represents the ultimate expression of this understanding, transforming the source of division into an opportunity for connection and mutual growth. The ripple effects of breaking generational patterns extend far beyond immediate family relationships. When we learn to respond to inherited reactivity with conscious awareness, we become sources of healing energy in all our relationships. We stop perpetuating cycles of unconscious hurt and begin modeling what it looks like to respond to life's challenges from wisdom rather than conditioning. This creates a field of possibility that others can feel and potentially learn from, even if they never consciously understand what's different. Perhaps most importantly, this work of pattern transformation teaches us something profound about the nature of true maturity and spiritual development. Rather than seeing ourselves as victims of our past or heroes who have transcended it, we can understand ourselves as links in a chain of transmission that we have the power to transform. We are both products of all who came before us and ancestors to all who will come after us. This perspective brings both humility about our conditioning and empowerment about our capacity to choose differently. The boy's story shows us that the moment of recognizing our inherited patterns doesn't have to be a moment of despair about how deeply conditioned we are. It can be a moment of liberation when we realize that what seemed like personal failing is actually shared human struggle, and that transformation is possible not through rejecting our inheritance, but through bringing consciousness to it. In that consciousness, patterns that have caused suffering for generations can finally find peace, and new possibilities can emerge for everyone touched by our transformation. In a world that measures revolution by the noise it makes and the institutions it destroys, there exists a quieter form of rebellion that transforms everything it touches without firing a single shot or raising a single voice in anger. This revolution happens one breath at a time, one step at a time, one moment of conscious presence at a time. It's the revolution of awakening to the extraordinary nature of ordinary life, and it has the power to liberate not just yourself, but everyone whose life you touch and everyone who came before you. What you're about to discover might seem impossibly simple at first. How the act of walking mindfully, drinking tea with awareness, or eating a meal in silence can become acts of profound transformation that ripple out to heal the world. But within these humble practices lies a power that tyrants fear and that no external force can ever take away from you, the power to be fully alive, fully present, fully free in any circumstances life might bring. The understanding begins with recognizing something that most of us have forgotten in our rush through modern life, that your body and mind, which seem so separate most of the time, are actually designed to work together as one integrated whole. Right now, as you listen to these words, your body might be here in this room while your mind is somewhere else entirely, replaying a conversation from yesterday, planning tomorrow's schedule, or lost in a daydream about somewhere you'd rather be. This split between physical presence and mental presence is so common we think it's normal, but it's actually a form of suffering that keeps us from experiencing the fullness of life. Buddhist teaching offers a beautifully simple remedy for this divided state of being. Between your scattered mind and your present body lies a bridge that's always available, always reliable, always calling you back home to yourself. That bridge is your breath. As soon as you place your attention on your breathing, really feeling the sensation of air entering and leaving your body, something magical happens. Your mind begins to settle into your body, and you start to become one person again, instead of two. This reunification of body and mind isn't just a pleasant feeling, it's the foundation for what one wise teacher called the most revolutionary act you can perform. When you breathe mindfully and bring your full attention to the simple act of taking a step, you're not just moving your body through space. You're generating what Buddhism calls the energy of freedom and solidity, a quality of presence that can transform not only your own experience, but the very fabric of reality around you. To understand how profound this practice really is, you need to recognize something that might surprise you about the nature of your existence. You are not a separate, isolated individual walking alone through life. You are a continuation of everyone who came before you, your parents, grandparents, and all the ancestors stretching back through countless generations who struggled and suffered and somehow found the strength to survive long enough to bring you into being. They live on not just in your genes, but in your cells, your nervous system, your patterns of thinking and feeling. In a very real sense, they are walking with you in every step you take. When you walk mindfully, placing your full attention on the sensation of your feet touching the earth, breathing consciously with each step, maintaining awareness of your body, moving through space, you're not walking alone. All your ancestors are taking that step with you. If you are free in that moment, they experience freedom. If you are peaceful, they find peace. If you are solid and grounded in the present moment, they too can rest in the stability that perhaps eluded them during their lifetimes. This isn't poetic metaphor, but a recognition of how deeply interconnected life really is. The ancestors who carried trauma, fear, and unresolved suffering live on in the patterns stored in your nervous system. When you learn to walk with such presence and awareness that you generate genuine peace and freedom, you're literally healing the pain they carried. You're offering them the liberation they couldn't find for themselves. This is why mindful walking can truly be called an act of revolution. It liberates not just you, but everyone whose life contributed to your existence. But to achieve this level of transformative presence, you must learn to invest your entire being, body, mind, and heart into each step. This isn't casual strolling while your mind wanders to other concerns. This is walking as a form of meditation, where every placement of your foot becomes an opportunity to touch the miracle of being alive. You walk slowly enough to really feel each step, breathing consciously with the rhythm of your movement, maintaining such complete awareness that you can sense the aliveness of the earth beneath your feet. When you walk with this quality of attention, something remarkable begins to happen to your ordinary experience. The simple act of moving from one place to another becomes a doorway into what mystics throughout history have called the kingdom of heaven, or the pure land of the Buddha. These aren't distant spiritual realms you have to die to reach. They're the extraordinary dimension of ordinary reality that becomes visible when you bring complete presence to whatever you're doing. This same revolutionary potential exists in every activity of daily life when approached with mindful awareness. Consider something as simple as drinking a cup of tea. Most of the time, we consume our beverages while thinking about other things, barely tasting what we're drinking, using the tea or coffee as fuel for our mental activities, rather than experiencing it as nourishment for our entire being. But when you learn to drink tea mindfully, the ordinary act becomes a gateway to profound peace and satisfaction. The practice begins before you even lift the cup to your lips. You pause and breathe consciously, bringing your scattered attention back to the present moment. You look at the tea with fresh eyes, as if seeing liquid for the first time. You notice the steam rising from the surface, the color of the brew, the warmth radiating from the cup in your hands. Already, through this simple act of attention, you've begun to arrive in the present moment. When you finally taste the tea, you invest your full awareness in the experience. You're not thinking about your to-do list or rehearsing conversations or planning your next meal. You're simply drinking tea with the same quality of attention you might bring to a sacred ceremony. In that moment of complete presence, you become real, and the tea becomes real. Life becomes real instead of the vague dream state in which most people spend their days. This distinction between living in reality and living in a kind of waking dream is crucial to understanding why mindful living is so revolutionary. When you're constantly thinking about the past or future, constantly preoccupied with mental stories and internal commentary, you're not actually living your life. You're living in your thoughts about your life. You miss the actual texture of experience, the richness of sensation, the simple miracle of being conscious in a physical body on a planet spinning through space. But when you learn to be fully present, when you can drink your tea with complete attention, walk down the street with total awareness, or listen to someone speak without your mind wandering to other concerns, you wake up from the dream of mental preoccupation and begin to inhabit your actual life. You discover that ordinary moments contain depths of beauty, meaning, and satisfaction that no amount of external achievement or accumulation can provide. This awakening to the present moment has profound implications for how you understand happiness and fulfillment. Most people spend their lives chasing future conditions they believe will make them happy: the right relationship, career success, financial security, better health, or the resolution of current problems. But this constant reaching toward an imaginary future happiness means they never fully receive the good that's available right now. They live in a state of perpetual postponement, always believing that contentment lies just around the next corner. The practice of mindful living reveals that this approach is backwards. Real satisfaction isn't found by changing your external circumstances, but by changing the quality of attention you bring to whatever circumstances you find yourself in. When you can be fully present with what's here, whether it's pleasant or challenging, familiar or strange, you discover that this moment contains everything you need to be at peace. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on positive change. Rather, it means acting from a foundation of present moment contentment rather than from a sense of lacking or needing life to be different than it is. When you're grounded in the peace that's available right now, your actions become more effective because they're motivated by wisdom and love rather than fear and desperation. The revolutionary nature of this practice becomes even clearer when you consider how it affects your relationships with other people. When you're truly present, when your body and mind are unified, and your attention is completely available, others can feel this quality of presence, even if they can't articulate what's different. You become like a peaceful lake that naturally calms the agitation of anyone who approaches its shores. Your presence becomes a gift that helps others remember their own capacity for peace and awareness. This is why mindful living is ultimately an act of service to the world. Every moment you spend in genuine presence, every step you take with full awareness, every cup of tea you drink with complete attention is contributing to the collective reservoir of peace and wisdom that's available to all beings. You're modeling what it looks like to be fully alive, and this modeling has a power that extends far beyond anything you might accomplish through conventional activism or social engagement. The practice requires learning to find the extraordinary within the ordinary, the sacred within the mundane. When you eat a simple meal, you can approach it as just another task to complete while thinking about other things, or you can receive it as a gift from the earth itself, the culmination of sunshine, rain, soil, and countless human hands working together to nourish your body. When you see your food this way and eat with gratitude and attention, even the simplest meal becomes a communion with the entire web of life that sustains you. The same transformative potential exists in every routine activity when approached with mindful awareness. Washing dishes becomes an opportunity to enjoy the warmth of water and the satisfaction of creating cleanliness and order. Walking to your car becomes a chance to feel your body moving through space and to notice the quality of light and air around you. Even waiting in line or sitting in traffic can become opportunities to practice presence and generate peace instead of frustration.